Good evening. He's one of South Australia's most evil men, but paedophile monster Peter Liddy, who preyed on young boys, is tonight a free man.
Now 83 years old and missing part of an ear, the disgraced magistrate shuffled out of the remand centre before being whisked away.
Reporters Hannah Ford and Lauren Rose have been following this story and are standing by as we begin our coverage.
An evil predator, free.
Peter, do you have any remorse for the boys' lives you destroyed?
Peter Liddy, now in his 80s, shuffles out of jail to a waiting car.
Excuse me.
Should you be out in the community, Peter?
The notorious molester not sorry and not answering questions.
Did you want to apologise at all?
And missing most of his right ear. How that happened during his 25 years behind bars remains a mystery, but his victims and their families say they wish him nothing but pain after the lifetime of hell they've endured.
It sickens me. It sickens me to my core.
Liddy was escorted by caseworkers to a Services Australia office on Henley Beach Road before he slipped out a back door and was driven away. Where? No one knows.
As far as I'm concerned, he's just, he's grazing in green pastures now, you know, and while others, like me and the other victims, we're not.
Liddy was jailed for the sexual assault of several boys aged between 8 and 10 years old. At the time, he was a surf lifesaving coach at Brighton, a volunteer, also a serving magistrate. During sentencing, his offending was described as violent in nature and even occurring in and around a Glenelg court. He's never pleaded guilty or shown remorse, the innocence of his victims stolen.
There was one of the boys, you know, he's no longer with us, and that's blood on Liddy's hands.
He remains on an interim home detention supervision order and requires permission to leave the house. He isn't allowed to be within 50 metres of a school and cannot access the internet. But those restrictions expire in 6 months, the government fighting for an extension. Reports on whether he can control his sexual urges have been ordered by the court.
I know for him to do what he did in the day, his urges were pretty strong. And he's a smart evil. He's not just evil, he's smart.
And tonight the public has no idea where Peter Liddy is being housed. The paedophile, one of the worst in the state's history, is now living amongst us somewhere. I've spoken to the victims and their families today who say they feel sick knowing that jail walls are no longer protecting them from him. A sleepless night ahead for them. Rosanna.
All right, thank you, Hannah. Now, Lauren Rose is at the Supreme Court for us. Lauren, Liddy could be back behind bars by Christmas.
Rosanna, that's certainly a possibility, and the government has been very clear about that. Liddy will return to the Supreme Court in November if 2 medical practitioners find the 83-year-old either can't or won't control his sexual urges. The Attorney General says he will be locked up again. KMR boasts that South Australia has the toughest child sex offender laws in the country, but of course Liddy could find himself back behind bars at any time if he breaches the conditions of his interim supervision order, and if that were to happen, he may never be allowed out again. Will.
All right, thank you, Lauren. There's relief on the way for cash-strapped South Aussie families as the government moves to fulfil its election promises through the budget.
But behind the flashy announcements, a worrying trend as state debt soars to eye-watering levels.
Tom Koutson-Tonus described his last budget in 2017 as a sexy red dress. 9 years later, a very different pitch.
It's relief for families and it's a stable budget for business.
Public school fees scrapped and Year 7 camps made free. The seniors card expanded. Stamp duty relief for downsizers and a boost to the rent-to-own housing scheme.
It saves South Australians collectively large amounts of money.
Celebrating a $189 million surplus set against a backdrop of rising red ink. State debt reaching $35 billion this year, climbing to $54 billion by 2030. A daily interest bill of $9 million.
They really don't have too much respect for taxpayer dollars. 27 out of 28 departments have blown their budgets.
South Australia is now quite clearly on the same trajectory as Victoria.
Health receives a $1.7 billion boost, $160 million for the Whyalla Steelworks. No fresh money needed for the new Women's and Children's Hospital. The Treasurer insists it's on budget.
We're not ashamed to say that this project is having difficulties, absolutely. But I'm not going to raise the white flag.
The Premier used his speech to announce a new $50 million Productivity Commission, while also taking a thinly veiled swipe at the Prime Minister over broken election commitments.
We're not having to increase taxes in a way that was unexpected by anybody.
Revenue approaching $34 billion, $1.8 billion from stamp duty, $2.2 billion in payroll tax and another $1 billion from motor vehicle taxes. A 12-month hiring freeze on non-frontline public sector workers to save $120 million.
Any cut to public service workers will result in a cut to frontline services being provided to the community.
So begins the government's budget PR blitz. Michaela Kamarek, 7 News.
A budget of no surprises and proudly sold that way by the Premier and the Treasurer.
Mike Smithson joins us in the studio. So, Smitho, is it good news, bad news, or just a giant yawn?
Well, Will, it was a deliberate ploy by the government to make this budget day go away and move on. They really had nothing to gain from today's events. They've emerged from a thumping election majority and mandate, had to deliver on campaign promises, and the Treasury cupboard is lacking loose change to spend. When Labor next goes to the polls, state debt will be at $54 billion, but the Premier has 3 clear years to work up the next sales pitch to voters. We're told times are tight and global uncertainty adds to the economic woes. Future surpluses will pale when compared to a debt which is costing currently $6 million a day in interest payments. Against that backdrop, public service cuts and nurses desperately fighting for a modest pay rise. Well, I was keen to throw a curly one to the Treasurer. How does he justify State Electoral Commissioner Mick Sherry still being on mystery leave with no return date and still being paid $325,000 a year plus super? It follows the bungled election fiasco and now an independent review.
I understand your outrage at this. The Electoral Commission doesn't follow our orders, they're independent. But I accept the point that you're making and the public's view of the way it's being conducted. But the independent review is there to look into it.
At the very least, the budget's delivered on Labor's election promises, meaning the government has kept its word. Will.